So we've talked about all the forwards here on Locked On Blue Jackets, and now it's time to move on to the defensemen. We are going to be talking today about Andrew Peeke. We're going to be talking about how his season was, how he can do in the future, what I think he needs to do to improve, and how he can keep his place in the lineup with a lot of very good young defensemen coming up the pipeline. That's all coming up today on Locked On Blue Jackets.
Locked On Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster, here to bring you the news, the stories, the trials, tribulations, and everything in between about your favorite team and mine, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for making this your first listen of the day every day. Locked On Blue Jacket is free and available on all podcast platforms and also over on YouTube. You're never going to have to get behind a paywall for a Locked On product, and that is our promise to you. So today, we are going to be talking about, like I said at the top of the episode, we're going to be continuing our season reviews. We're moving on to the defensemen. We've done all of the forwards, and it took forever. Luckily, there are a lot fewer defensemen. I think they used 11 defensemen this season, which is more than maybe they should, but not nearly as many as the forwards, so it's fine. And we're going to be starting off with number 2. We're going to be starting off with Andrew Peeke. We're going to be talking about how his season was. I believe this was his first full season with the Blue Jackets. Not a bad. I don't know if this was technically his rookie season or not, but not a bad first full season for Andrew Peeke. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about what he needs to do to kind of keep on this development path that he's on, and we're also going to take a quick look at the defensive depth charts. Before we get started, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the World Juniors, because the World Juniors is happening at the minute. I haven't been tweeting about it a lot, or, if at all. I think yesterday I tweeted a picture of Kent Johnson, and that was kind of the first time that I acknowledged the World Juniors on the podcast or on my my personal Twitter. And the thing is, with everything that's going on with Hockey Canada at the minute and everything to do with the World Juniors, it didn't sit right with me to talk about this as if it was any other tournament. And a lot of advertisers have pulled out, a lot of sponsors have pulled out. There's not as much hype around it, and I think for good reason. And for me personally, I think I didn't want to talk about World Juniors because it didn't feel right to cover this tournament like it was any other tournament because of the 2003 case, the 2018 case, everything that's kind of gone on since then, where they clearly don't think that they've done anything wrong, and no one is resigning or being forced out or being fired or anything. And so we're not going to be talking about World Juniors on the podcast. We do have plenty of content lined up that is not World Juniors, but just to kind of clear that up, we're not going to be covering any of the World Juniors games. We're not going to be talking about the World Juniors, and there are plenty of podcasts out there that are going to be talking about the World Juniors. So if you want to go listen to those instead, then I completely understand. But for me personally, I didn't feel like I wanted to give the World Juniors the media attention given everything that's going on with Hockey Canada at the minute. So that's that. That's out of the way. Let's talk about Andrew Peeke, because first full season with the Blue Jackets. He played 11 games last season in the 2021 season. I always get thrown off by that. And then he played 22 games in the 2019-2020 season. So first full 82-game season. I believe he was one of literally 2 Blue Jackets that played every single game. The other one was Gus Nyquist, which we talked about before. That's really fun considering he missed every single game last season. To come back and play all to 82 this season was really, really good. So good for Gus Nyquist, but also good for Andrew Peeke, who in a season where there was a lot of defensemen injured. There were a lot of defensemen in and out of the lineup. Like I said, I think they played 11 different defensemen this season. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Correct. Yep, 11 defensemen. That was a pretty good guess from me. To have a guy to play all 82 games is pretty impressive. So let's talk a little bit about Andrew Peeke, former second-round pick in 2016, played 3 years at the University of Notre-Dame, and then came to, turn pro, split time between the AHL and the NHL for a couple of seasons this year, finally made the jump full-time to the big team with the defensive depth on the team not super good. He really kind of saw his opportunity and he took it. He played a ton this season. I haven't pulled up his ice time average, but I suspect it's a lot because, especially towards the end of the season, when Werenski was out injured, he got shut down near the end of the season. He was playing a lot of time on ice. Yeah, he didn't dip below 20 minutes. For basically the entirety of April. He played 15 minutes in one game, and he played 19 minutes in another. But I believe his season high was 27 minutes, which is so many minutes. That was against Tampa Bay. He scored a goal in that game as well, which good for him. One of only 2 goals that season. So, well, congrats to him for playing a bajillion minutes and still managing to put some points up on the scoreboard. He had 15 points in total this season, 2 goals, 13 assists. That's about what I expect from Andrew Peeke. Honestly, he, I think, is not typically an offensive guy. I think he can be. I think he's got a pretty good shot, but I don't know that that's where his particular strengths lie. I think he has strengths in other areas, but I think, and this is something we're going to talk about in the next segment in terms of what can he do to be better next season. I got a really interesting comment from Sad Girl Hours, friend of the show, and she talked a little bit about how to really succeed for Peak next year. He has to focus on his defensive game, and he has to be that David Savard player that he kind of that's his archetype, similar to Gavrikov. Gavrikov is again a very kind of defensive guy. He can turn it on offensively and does, to the stress of many, I'm sure. But I think Peak especially is really that David Savard type that we're looking for, where he's big, he throws his body around, he'll block shots. Not the most gifted guy in the world defensively, but doesn't need to be, because I don't think every defenseman should be offensively minded. I think you do need to have 1 or 2 of those defensive guys, and I think Andrew Peeke is one of those guys. So in a minute, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, about how I think that went for him this season, and what he needs to do to improve next season. But first, I want to tell you about BetOnline, because it's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. You can find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, even golf, and the NHL. The NFL is back. The preseason started last night, I believe. So if you want to put money on the football, then you can do that. BetOnline, they continue to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They've got you covered for all of that. So head to BetOnline today, or use your mobile device to learn about the action happening today, because BetOnline is where the game starts. And where this second segment is starting is with Andrew Peeke. Just like the last one. And before we kind of get started with kind of his future on the team, I do want to touch on a couple of things that I want him to improve on. Because he took a lot of penalties last season. He had 60 penalty minutes. I don't know what that is for the team. It looks like it was third most on the team. Vladislav Gavrikov led the way with 68. Sean Corelli had 61, which surprised me. And then Andrew Peeke at 60. That is so many penalty minutes. That is a lot of penalty minutes for for Andrew Peeke, I would like if he could cut that in half. I understand that the kind of game he plays means he's going to be taking penalties. There's a lot of penalties to take in your own zone. He's not the fastest guy in the world. He's big, so that slows him down a little bit. His skating's fine for a bigger guy, I think, but the nature of the game is the defensemen, I think, are going to take more penalties. But I would like if he took less than 30 penalties next season. I feel like some of those are probably fights. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I don't have the breakdown in front of me, but less fights, less penalty minutes altogether, and I think that would really, really help his game and maybe give him a chance to be on the penalty kill a little bit more. I think that's a place that he hasn't really been used or utilized properly. I think they could really use him on the penalty kill, especially, they keep losing all of their best penalty killers. With the departure of, guys like David Savard, with the departure of guys like Cam Atkinson, Nick Foligno, standard penalty killers, I think that's somewhere that Andrew Peeke can really have some potential to shine. So if he takes less penalties, then he'll get more chances to be on the penalty kill, which that's just math, people. So that's my biggest problem with how Peeke sees it, is too many penalty minutes. My other kind of, not problem necessarily, but something I talked about, in the last segment, is I feel like a lot of times he focused on being that offensive defenseman, and that's just not necessarily where his skills lie or where the team needs him to be. I don't have a problem with defensemen scoring goals. We talk about it on this podcast all the time. This team is 5 Rovers and Vladislav Gavrikov, but I feel like maybe it should be 4 Rovers, Vladislav Gavrikov, and Andrew Peeke, especially with guys like Juracek potentially coming in. I think there's something to be said for having a guy on the right side who can play that kind of Gavrikov role of being a shutdown defenseman. Obviously, Eric Branson coming in is going to be not an issue necessarily. Well, it is going to be an issue, but I will do there's a whole other podcast about Eric Branson somewhere in me, I'm sure. He plays a very similar game to Andrew Peeke, but he costs more money and I think is more detrimental to the team. So that could be interesting. And frankly, if we have to bench someone for Branson, like, as much as I like Peeke, I would rather Peeke sat for Branson than, say, sitting David Juracek or sitting Jake Bean or sitting Adam Boquist, the young defensemen that still have a chance to develop in this league. Not that Peeke is not a good young defenseman that is still developing in this league, but because he plays the same kind of game as Branson, I do feel like, and they're not going to sit Branson. He's making $4 million a year, and they're all super excited about how he's going to stop the Blue Jackets being bullied or whatever, which is still nonsense. But it is what it is. I've said my piece on that. I'm sure I'll say it again many times this season. I don't think the Blue Jackets were bullied last season. I don't think they needed a guy to come in and throw his weight around when they have guys like Andrew Peeke already on the roster. I think David Juracek can be that guy as well, but also be good at hockey. So, there's that. But I keep saying I'm not going to get into it and then getting into it, but it's fine. Andrew Peeke and Eric Branson are cut from the same cloth. They're not going to sit Branson. He makes too much money and has that quote unquote veteran presence and that grit and that willingness to fight, blah, blah, blah. So I do feel like Andrew Peeke might find himself not necessarily on the outside this season, but looking at the depth chart for the Blue Jackets defensemen, suddenly they've gone from having no one on the right side to having, 4 or 5 guys that could play those three, could be in those three spots. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's what's coming up next on Locked on Blue Jackets. We're going to talk a little bit about the defensive depth. Does Andrew Peeke manage to keep his space, or does he lose it to Eric Branson, or does he lose it to David Juracek? Maybe that's all coming up next on Locked on Blue Jackets. So like I teased at the end of last segment. It's very early here. The Blue Jackets have a lot of right defensemen. now, which is weird because we didn't really have any maybe 6 months ago, but that's beside the point. I maintain that David Juracek can make this team out of camp. I think he could conceivably play in the top 4 this season. I think he's one of the brightest defensive prospects that the Blue Jackets have. He's the brightest defensive prospect that the Blue Jackets have. Actually, I think he's one of the brightest defensive prospects in the league at wide. He was my favorite defenseman from the draft, but this is not a David Juracek. It's not a David Juracek episode. We will have many future David Juracek episodes. The point I'm making here is, I feel like Andrew Peeke, through no fault of his own, has suddenly been leapfrogged in the depth chart by Eric Branson, which I talked about in the last segment. It is what it is. I don't have to like it. Well, I probably should like it, but I'm not going to, and they can't make me. But I don't make the decisions. Brad Larson makes the decision, so it's fine. And I can see him getting leapfrogged by David Juracek as well, who again plays a similar role to Peake, but better. I think he has that kind of that tenacity. He's a pain in the butt to play against. He has that two-way game. He has that offensive game. He's just so good. And I think Andrew Peake might struggle a little bit this season. On the other hand, maybe he won't. And here is why. I think the Blue Jackets are a little bit not disillusioned, but I feel like Jake Bean has not had a chance to make as much of an impact as the Blue Jackets were hoping for him to make. He's still very young. He's, I think, 23 or just turned 24. So again, kind of in the same age as Andrew Peake, in that similar uh, point in his development. He spent some time injured this season. So, I don't know that the Blue Jackets really got a good look at who Jake Bean is. But like I said, with Eric Branson coming on board, with Anna Boquist really kind of starting to find a groove with the Blue Jackets, with Andrew Peake on that right side, with David Juracek coming in, like it's gonna be crowded, especially for those top 4 positions. Like coming into the off season, I was like, right, so our top 6 defensemen are Werenski, Boquist, Gavrikov, Bean, Peake, and Blankenberg. Those are our guys. Blankenberg is another right defenseman as well. He's got to find some time. I suspect Blankenberg is going to spend some time in the AHL this season. We've got a whole episode on Blankenberg coming up later. I love Nick Blankenberg, but again, another right defenseman that you've got to find space for on a very crowded blue line all of a sudden. So, looking at all of those right side defensemen, I don't know that Peake is in the top 3 of that. It's, and it could get interesting. It could get a little interesting. And I don't want him to turn into kind of the Scott Harrington type. We're going to talk about Scott Harrington on Monday, but and I like Scott Harrington a lot. He's very good at what he does, which is be that 7th defenseman who can kind of hop in and out of the lineup as needed. I feel like putting that job on Andrew Peake's shoulders is a mistake. I think Andrew Peeke, if they don't want him in the NHL, which I think they probably should, I think again he's a very good second or third pairing guy. He's a good second pairing guy. I think he's a very good third pairing guy. Or put him in the AHL and watch him just light up down there, and then try again in a couple of years. And I think Andrew Peeke has earned the chance to be in the NHL, but it all comes down to: do you want your prospects sitting on the bench? Do you want them playing top line minutes in the AHL? He played some of his best hockey last season in the AHL. He was one of their best guys. He didn't play a ton of games for them, but he was, he had 16 points in 29 games in his rookie season with the Monsters. Then he only played 7 games last season. He had spent a lot of time injured, I believe, but he had 4 points in those 7 games. He was good for the Monsters, and I think it would be a mistake to kind of give him the Scott Harrington treatment and just let him kind of languish in the press box or on the bench. But it is what it is. I like him a lot. I just don't know if there's room for him on this year's blue line, especially considering the moves that they've made. He's under contract for at least this season, I know. Maybe next season as well. I don't recall off the top of my head. No, he is an RFA next season. He that could be interesting. I think they'll probably qualify him, but again, it depends on how he plays this season. I have just realised that he would have to go through waivers to be in Cleveland. So again, we'll keep an eye on that. We'll see how that goes, and hopefully the Blue Jackets find a space for him because I do really like Andrew Peeke, and I do think, like I said, I think he could be a very good third pairing guy. I think there's no shame in being a good third pairing guy, or he could be a perfectly serviceable second pairing guy with Gavrikov on that second line. So that's kind of all I've got for you today. It's Sunday today, so there'll be a new episode tomorrow. We're going to be talking about Scott Harrington, who, again, didn't play a ton this season, but I think he has a really interesting job with the team. He only played 7 games, but he was with the team most of the season, I believe. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his impact in Monsters, and if the Blue Jackets could bring him back. He's currently unsigned, I believe, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. I've been Jay Foster. You can find me on Twitter at _Jacob Foster, JAKOBFORSTER. You can find this podcast at LO_Blue Jackets. If you have comments, questions, criticisms, you can email me at lockedonbluejackets@gmail.com. And thank you once again for making this your first listen of the day every day. Locked on Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms, and we're also over on YouTube. The YouTube is just going from strength to strength. I'm almost at 200 subscribers, so if you want to go and hit the subscribe button over there, I appreciate it, and I appreciate you. And until tomorrow, make sure you stay locked on.